David was prying into this quote, a labourer in the vineyard of Scottish antiquities. Where did I get it from? I'll explain in just a moment. Fair to say it's not a quote normally associated with Sir Walter Scott. The famous author's hobbyhorsical obsession with his flibbity-gibbet of a house and the treasures it contains have ensured that the serious and scholarly side to his compulsion to collect is often overshadowed by an eccentric caricature of his own making. Always keen to play down a sense of self-importance, Scott was remarkably eager to poke fun at himself and to encourage others to join in with the game. The quote is in fact Scott's own, and it comes from one of the most important sources in the history of Abbotsford and its interiors, Reliquiae Trotscosiensis. Lucky me for having to say all these titles, by the way. And that is a delightfully whimsical exploration of the writer's own home and collection, written in the first person. Although thinly veiled as a piece of fiction related to Scott's third and favourite novel, The Antiquary, published back in 1816, the place it describes is unmistakably Abbotsford, his beloved home of almost 20 years. As the project was started in ailing health, the unfinished manuscript was left behind on the author's death in 1832. What survives is a kind of swan song, offering us a tantalising glimpse of Scott as a voluble host, welcoming visitors to his home in the Borders and delighting them with tales of adventure, intrigue, and bloodshed relating to the objects they could see within. The work was unpublished during his lifetime, but this fabulous edition, I can't recommend it enough, published by Alison Lumsden and Jerry Carruthers in 2004, is never too far from my bedside, and I'm pleased to say that the content provides the foundation for Abbotsford's guided tours to this very day. There's something incredibly powerful about reading a reflective account of Abbotsford and its contents in the very words of its creator, particularly words crafted for shared consumption rather than the very many in private correspondence. It feels like a final tribute to a romance in stone that had completely absorbed Scott's mind and emptied his purse for the best part of 2 decades. And it's fitting that despite many of Scott's original manuscripts having been sold by the family after his death, Reliquiae remains in our care as a treasure of the Faculty of Advocates, Abbotsford Collection Trust, and more of that dual custodianship later. So, back to our vineyard. As ever, when you're dissecting the phrase of a wordsmith, the devil is very much in the detail. To be a labourer is to toil. It isn't a glamorous occupation, and the work is usually directed or supervised by a superior power. Vineyards are tended by a team of such labourers, and only through careful, sustained, and methodical work can they reap the harvest. This egalitarian approach is Scott through and through, despite the elitist shadow that sometimes hangs over him, quite undeservedly. Scott was always an active part of the antiquarian network, both north and south of the border, and indeed internationally, sharing ideas, research, and objects in his possession with others, sometimes acting as a temporary custodian of material destined for elsewhere, including for this society. And I should see, what you can see here is one of David Wilkie's sketches from dated 1822, but harking back to the 4th of February 1818 as the honours of Scotland were revealed. And that's the linen sheet that they were wrapped in being lifted up. And this is Scott and his fellow committee members who had been appointed to rediscover, in inverted commas, the lost regalia of Scotland. A man of the Enlightenment, Scott understood the benefits of the meeting of minds and the conversation that ensues. It's a shame he isn't on the Brexit committee, really. The sociability of antiquarian culture in the 19th century is explored by Professor Philippa Levine in her work, The Amateur and the Professional, Historians, Antiquarians and Archaeologists in Victorian England. But it's fair to say it's perhaps at its zenith in the Edinburgh of the late 18th century. Here, in this vineyard of enthusiasts, Scott sees himself as a cog in the antiquarian machine, a torchbearer in a quest for understanding that will continue for generations after his passing. It is therefore fitting that his Abbotsford collection was partially curated by a committee of discerning enthusiasts, with halls of material, individual curios and rare books arriving here from friends and distant associates far and wide. These individuals were all anxious to contribute to what was fast becoming a physical repository of cultural memory. As Anne Rigney astutely remarks, this was material crowdfunding of the times. And what does he mean by the vineyard of Scottish antiquities? And presumably this isn't a comment on the antiquarian's weakness for claret, I couldn't possibly say. Is this vineyard rich in the fruits or the treasures of Scottish-born antiquaries, or does it contain material purely with a national bent? Despite the fact that Scot is so associated with a version of Scotland's past promoted in his Waverley novels, I'm inclined to think he meant the former. Although fiercely proud of his country and its distinctive identity, Scotland's place in the world and its wider relationships and networks were of great fascination to Walter Scott. His personal collection is a treasure trove of international significance, containing material from almost every continent on Earth. We have to remember that Scott's collection doesn't start and end at the imposing porchway to Abbotsford, incidentally modelled on the addition to Linlithgow Palace during the reign of King James V. Salvaged sculpture and architectural fragments from lost or demolished buildings are incorporated into the very fabric of the house itself. The South Court garden showcases a quirky reimagining of an Elizabethan long gallery, a trellised green walkway for viewing stone sculptures from the Mercat Cross of Edinburgh, the Roman fort at Old Penrith, Italy, and even Java. The woodland plantations that Scott cultivated around his home were also embellished with architectural fragments, including the original lintel of the Tolbooth doorway and masonry from Melrose Abbey, buildings that Scott had witnessed the demolition of and spearheaded the conservation of, respectively. And just hopping back to this previous slide, those of you that have been to Abbotsford will certainly or hopefully have noticed this doorway on the right, which is built into the first floor of the building, just above the entrance hall. That was the original main entrance door to the Tolbooth prison. We have what's probably a 16th century heraldic detail here, probably from a demolished building of Edinburgh. And then above it is a marriage lintel dated 1616, and that's built into the east face. And there are many, many examples of this kind of salvage material that end up within the fabric of the wider building. I have the enormous pleasure, under the direction of the Board of Trustees, to care for the built structures, interiors and collections belonging to the Abbotsford Trust and the Faculty of Advocates Abbotsford Collection Trust. It is quite simply an honour to have a platform to share my work and the broader vision for Abbotsford's future with fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, a venerable institution of which Scott himself was vice-president, although Scott habitually dropped the vice element of this particular accolade, talking himself up as usual. Tonight, more than ever, I shall feel Sir Walter looking over my shoulder. Now, I've taken the rather bold step of assuming a little contextual knowledge on the part of my audience here tonight, and looking at that show of hands at the beginning, that was a wise move, I think. There will be no whistle-stop tour through the chronology of Scott's life, and no introduction to the evolution of Abbotsford as a building. For anyone groaning at this omission, I can only defend myself by saying that if I've learned one thing in my almost 5 years wedded to the visionary mind of Scott, is that there is always too much to say and too little time, something that those that may have struggled with his novels may be inclined to agree with. In comparison with the situation in early 2013, when Abbotsford trustee George Dalgleish addressed the Society, or indeed back in 2000, when the Society held a fantastic conference dedicated to Abbotsford's image and influence in honour of the late, great Clive Wainwright, Abbotsford is now able to offer a richer and more authoritative experience than ever before, courtesy of the achievements of our major restoration programme between 2010 and 2013. Alongside some of the finest Georgian interiors surviving in Scotland, and those are Ian Gow's words, not mine, and a time capsule of a collection left almost entirely in situ, you can explore a free permanent exhibition space charting the life and experience of Sir Walter before he buys the Abbotsford site. And you can take an audio tour utilising many of the writer's own words. This is a completely different kind of historic house experience, authentic, atmospheric, and deeply personal. In case you haven't heard, we also have a scenic train line from Edinburgh too. The shameless plug stops here, don't worry. So, just how significant is the Abbotsford collection? Well, Scott had been collecting artefacts since boyhood, creating a bedroom museum simply bristling with broadswords, Lochaber axes, and an impressive collection of ancient coins that he'd show off to anyone that had half an interest. Many of the people sitting in this audience may have had collections of their own at home, feeling that same compulsion to preserve the past, and perhaps even to curate domestic displays. Ordinarily, these homegrown collections start with a theme or a type of artefact, but in youth, Scot was preoccupied with the whole story of his native land as it was told through her material culture. And here he is in the shadow of Smailham Tower, which is a tower house associated with his ancestors, the Scots of Harden, absolutely enraptured by what the shepherd is, the tales the shepherd is regaling him with. This powerful compulsion to tell Scotland's own story, was the same driving force that would eventually result in the publication of the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border in 1802, Scott's groundbreaking collection of balladry from the oral tradition that became the springboard for his original poetry. This youthful Walter fell for Jacobitism, lock, stock, and barrel, his phrase, and letters from these early days betray a growing patriotic zeal. The young collector even decided to snub his collection of Roman coins in favour of swapping them for their medieval Scottish brethren. As Scot matured, his horizons broadened, and with the inquiring mind of an advocate and a sheriff's considered judgment, he began to find resonance in and draw parallels between Scotland's story and that of other cultures, peoples, and times. The same themes and preoccupations crop up again and again: the cultural conflicts between old worlds and the new, tradition and innovation, belief systems and scientific thought. Scot was interested in the point of cultural collision and the journey towards resolution, or indeed the road to destruction. I believe that is why Scot owned items such as Maori patu, you can see on the left. These are ceremonial war clubs, rare dictionaries of the Native American language, shark-tooth carved paddles from the Austral Islands south of Tahiti, and Roman antiquities from Hadrian's Wall. This was cultural boxing in action, and he found it utterly compelling. Perhaps this interest in boundaries and points of exchange was in some way more resonant for a Scottish borderer, hailing from a liminal land that had passed between crowns and had arguably never been answerable to either. There's something wonderfully evocative about a writer's collection, and curatorially it raises a plethora of issues. Museums have a duty to present an unbiased, factual, and current interpretation of their collections for the visiting public. But at Abbotsford, we have historical reality and Scots reality, held in a sometimes uneasy counterbalance. Our visitors often ask with half a smile on their face whether they should believe Scot or not. The problem seems to be one of authenticity, and indeed one of your American fellows wrote to me very recently on the subject. How might one square the circle of the venerable Scot playing fast and loose with history? Shouldn't an academic and an antiquarian know better? The willingness of Scot to fill in the gaps and to take imaginative liberties does leave me with a tangled web to unpick, but I'm adamant we will never stop telling his stories at Abbotsford. After all, so much of what we have is so resonant purely because of him and not despite him. Above all else, he was a writer and a storyteller. Developments in scientific and ethnographical study and the collaboration between institutions and experts has dispelled many myths over the course of the last 2 centuries. Some items that Scot assumed to be from a particular era, culture, or centre, we now know to have very different provenance. It is highly unlikely, for example, that the crucifix attributed to Mary, Queen of Scots, really does date from the 16th century. Stylistically, it appears to be an 18th century souvenir from the Holy Land. Another grander example is this suit of armour on the right here that Scot was told had an association with the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. With a writer's desire to see history from a human perspective, he imagines the wearer might just have been Sir John Cheney, the tallest man on the battlefield that day and personal bodyguard to Henry Tudor. Cheney was also one of history's great turncoats, having previously supported the Yorkists' claim before Richard III arrived on the scene. Romanced by the mere possibility of a connection, the story became an established fact trumpeted by Abbotsford guides for many generations. Alas, the suit of armour is about 50 years too late in its design, but the Cheney connection has stuck fast, and Scot's episode of wishful thinking is still told to this day, prefixed by the necessary caution. Scot was also not adverse to a little theatre, or perhaps more accurately, generous lashings of it. He interspersed his displayed collection with replica items, seemingly never choosing to refer to these interlopers as anything other than the real thing. In the entrance hall of Abbotsford, you can see this on the left, this oyster veneered kingwood casket on its pedestal, with an identical twin on show in the armoury. And ordinarily in our stored collection, but currently on display in the visitor centre, we also have a brass-strapped writing box of exactly the same design in miniature. These pieces are all seemingly modelled upon the money box of Prince Charles Edward Stuart, left behind at Drumlanrig Castle as the prince hurriedly retreated back to the Highlands and his eventual defeat at Culloden. Scot had ample opportunity to examine the real piece, as it was owned by his friend and patron, the Duke of Buccleuch. And you can just make out on the chair at the bottom of the bed there, the original in the room at Drumlanrig, known as the Prince's Bedchamber. In the same room, the entrance hall of Abbotsford, hanging over the doorway, is an item that has fascinated visitors for generations. The branks, or scold's bridle, the iron frame and muzzle used to torture and gag dissenters, gossips, and suspected heretics in the 16th century, although isolated cases occur as late as the mid-19th century. Although it was known to be a replica, the story of the item's arrival at Abbotsford only came to light fairly recently, as I was trawling the appendix to the History of the Isle of Man, published in 1845 by Scott's friend, the Galloway exciseman and Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, Joseph Train. And there we go. In Scotland, the branks were used for more offensive purposes. In the Church of St Mary at St Andrews is kept one of the instruments called the Bishop's Branks, which were worn by the martyr George Wishart when he was burnt at the stake in that city. A model of these branks, which I got made in 1821, can be seen at the museum at Abbotsford. Wishart died, by the way, in 1546, and his follower, John Knox, would go on to have a key role in the Scottish Reformation. Experiencing the interiors of Abbotsford today, where everything appears antique to the eye, it is easy to forget that the wall-mounted displays and the cabinets of curiosities were also resonant with and relevant to Scott's contemporary world. Curatorially, it's a bold move to pepper a collection of age and pedigree with contemporary objects. Scot is so often accused of wistfully looking backwards to the good old days, but in readily incorporating items associated with individuals and events unfolding within his own lifetime, he was making key judgments about the present and looking keenly towards the future legacy of the world that he and his contemporaries were shaping. The Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath, politically, socially, and economically, undoubtedly defined the era. Central questions about rulership, democracy, revolution, tyranny, corruption, all still resonate today. So, when you look at Abbotsford's west wall in the entrance hall, which is mounted with a French cuirass and a Polish or Dutch lancer's garb from Waterloo, you're left to wonder whether the clever face-off created between these items and those on the opposing wall, which are our 16th century suits of armour, is deliberate. If so, it could be read as contemporary threat versus feudal defence, invasive new ideas encroaching upon tradition and wrestling with the weight of history. And as you walk the gardens, consciously and meticulously designed as intricate, immersive spaces for conversation and philosophical discussion, you would have done so against a stimulating backdrop of salvaged pieces that reflect on points of cultural difference. The Word of God and medieval religious iconography sits alongside material reinforcing the authority of state, monarch, and guild. All of this asks fundamental questions about allegiance and belonging, both historically and contemporarily. It sometimes feels as if Scot has deliberately left us, and particularly me, with a fiendish puzzle to solve, where the real and the imitation jostle with one another for supremacy. This effect is heightened in a disorientating architectural, not archaeological, I've got archaeology on the brain, architectural environment, where starkly different building elevations, from manor house to castellation, and assemblages of disparate items and features, some that are dizzying echoes of other buildings and places, all of this causes us to lose our anchor in space and time. I see it again and again. Abbotsford has a curiously emotional effect on people who revel in the sheer escapism of it all. I think this effect is entirely deliberate. Scot claimed that at Abbotsford he had decided to include everything except that which is tedious. It's a wonderful quote. And the result is a place more reflective of a palace of collective memory than a home, a stage set for history, but not staged history itself. I've been thinking increasingly about terms such as augmented reality that have become common parlance in our technological era, and I now suggest this is what Scot was doing here at Abbotsford, superimposing layers of culture and time upon one place in a self-consciously experiential way. This was living history in its truest sense. It is increasingly well understood by literary scholars that Scot used the Abbotsford environment, and indeed his collection and library, housed in Edinburgh at 39 North Castle Street, as springboards for story and essential fuel for his prolific creative output. This was the means by which he was able to animate the past so convincingly. The way in which Scot writes about objects that characters can see or interact with in his novels offers a kind of how-to guide for his readers on authorial process. If his compulsion was sometimes to fill in the gaps in the stories of real objects he acquired by giving them a human angle, one is just as likely to stumble across an object or book from his collection in his published fiction. Such as the keys to Loch Leven, which are on the left there, acquired by Scot from the antiquarian William Hamper ahead of his writing the novel The Abbot, published in 1820. Or indeed the menacing horns of the bull that chases Lucy in The Bride of Lammermoor, a descendant of the prehistoric oryx that now hangs in Abbotsford's entrance hall. Sometimes Scot is explicit about this connection, particularly in his authorial notes and asides, but in other cases it's an in-joke from an anonymous author, an insistence of what the Scot academic Jane Milgate calls Scot's pattern of near disclosure as author of his books. I should just say, if you're wondering why there's two sets of keys there, the Abbotsford keys, supposedly Loch Leven's keys, are on the left, and what we have on the right are the keys to Loch Leven that are in the National Collection. It seems that Loch Leven has been dredged a great many times looking for the keys that sprung Mary Queen of Scots from her imprisonment. So which one do you think is real, if any? It's very much up to you to decide. What I'd like to do at this point is focus on a few case studies just to give you a flavour of the diversity of the Abbotsford collection and the twists and turns of our slippery friend Provenance in this environment where stories and objects seem to beget one another. I love these quotes, so I shall read them. The first one is Jonathan Oldbuck, the Antiquary, the eponymous Antiquary of the novel. The same objects are before us. They are permanent and the same. But when we look upon them in cold, unfeeling old age, can we, changed in our temper, our pursuits and our feelings, changed in our form, our limbs and our strength, can we ourselves be called the same? And the second quote is actually from the journal. I realised last minute I put very proudly from the letters of Sir Walter Scott, but I can assure you this is Scott's journal entry, our part of it, from the 1st of January 1826. And I love this. I think it's really, really powerful. A thought strikes me. People say the whole human frame in all its parts and divisions is gradually in the art of decaying and renewing. What a curious timepiece it would be that could indicate to us the moment this gradual and insensible change had so completely taken place that no atom was left of the original person. Yes. You can see why he likes surrounding himself with things now, can't you? If Scot found an emotional residue in objects that could help his mind and his pen to access the people of the past, he was also powerfully aware of the irony of things, often mundane, utilitarian things, outliving their makers and users. As he entered into the final phase of building and improvement work at Abbotsford in his lifetime in the 1820s and began keeping his journal in 1825, he was becoming acutely aware of his own changed state and the deterioration of his mental and physical health. The sources show that the legacy of his Abbotsford project and the future prospects of his family weighed heavy on his mind. I believe that this preoccupation with the passage of time and the unavoidable truth that it stopped for no man provided the impetus for one of the most intriguing pieces in the Abbotsford collection. Unique, as far as we know, in the whole world, I give you Scot's stone long case clock, following its restoration and rebuild back in 2016. Modelled upon Regency grandfather clocks made in wood such as mahogany, the sculptor John Smith of Darnick has expertly recreated the mortise and tenon joints normally found in carpentry in stone, locking the three sections of the body together. We can be almost certain that the Smith family was involved due to the discovery of a diary entry from 1823 in which the Mason brothers discussed their plans for a clock being taken up to Edinburgh. Sadly, the original movement of the clock is lost to time, forgive the pun, but in 2017 we were thrilled to work with the local clockmaker, and here he is on the right, sourcing an appropriate 8-day movement of the period to restore the piece to its former working glory, and it's now a permanent fixture of our exhibition space. So what on earth might a stone clock mean? Perhaps it's a commentary of time standing still, or a playful amalgamation of sundial and clock. Or perhaps it's simply testament to a relationship between master and craftsman and their in-jokes and camaraderie. Or simply because it was possible. Who can say? What better gift to give an antiquarian and a storyteller with one foot and a great deal of his heart firmly set in the past than a piece that paradoxically represents both the passing of time and the immutability of stone. It's a wonderful piece, and it's got a lovely tone as well, so you can see this free of charge in Abbotsford's Visitor Centre exhibition. And just for a bit of context, we have a sketch of Scot by one of his legal colleagues from 1825 over in the corner, just to sort of set the scene of him getting older by this point. And in the middle here, one of Henry Fox Talbot's images, very early images, photographs of Abbotsford. And the reason I've put that in there is just to the bottom left corner of the image, you can see a hint of what's actually the fountain in the South Court. That's in its original position, very close to the house. And you can see some long Gothic windows, some elongated Gothic windows. That's the old conservatory or garden room of Abbotsford before its demolition, reappropriation as part of the 1850s edition. And my theory is that indoor-outdoor space may have been the original home of the Longcase clock, which for many years after that was sitting in an outbuilding in pieces, very, very unloved, as a bit of a quirky mystery. One of the great joys of my role is to restore lost provenance to the forgotten pieces of the Abbotsford collection. Through the great many letters mentioning object exchange or gifts sent to Scot, and through the memoirs of those closest to him, it has been possible to trace the stories of a great many objects in our care, from the human skull, thought to have been taken from the massacre cave on the Isle of Egg, scene of mass murder of the MacDonald clan in the late 16th century, to this wonderful collection of late medieval deeds complete with pendant seals. Research has shown that this was gifted to Scot by his friend and neighbour and fellow legal man, William Riddle, on the 5th of November 1824. The documents have actually been bound in a severely cropped edition of a rare 17th century book called A Tragicomical History of Our Times. And if you look closely, you can actually see that parts of those pages have actually been reappropriated as guard strips for the seals, so the poor book has had a pretty tough time of it. The inscriptions inside this collection reveal the previous owners and borrowers of the collection, from the Suffolk antiquarian Thomas Martin of Palgrave to Peter Leneve, antiquary, herald, and the first president of the Society of Antiquaries of London. Sorry about that one, folks. If we return to that caricature I mentioned at the very beginning of my paper, that eccentric collector and hoarder, unable to refuse any material that came his way, I wanted to highlight two objects that illustrate, firstly, that Scot had a sense of propriety, and that when he borrowed material from others, he did in fact return said material, and secondly, that he was discerning, and that there was a criteria of sorts applied to the possible acquisitions that came his way. Some of Scot's characters were indeed based on real-life counterparts, and much of this detail about his original sources and inspiration is extrapolated upon in his authorial notes to the magnum opus editions of his novels that were published between 1829 and 32. You can think of these effectively as the director's cuts of the Waverley novels. His fourth novel, Old Mortality, memorialises the activity of the stonemason Robert Patterson, who travelled right around Scotland with his rustic hammer or mell in tow, carving inscriptions on the many unmarked graves of the Covenanters that had lost their lives during the religious wars of the 17th century. This mell had come into the possession of Scot's antiquarian friend, Joseph Train, and surviving letters demonstrate that along with the story of Patterson himself, Train also forwarded on the famous hammer to Abbotsford. It arrived with Scot while he was writing the novel, and presumably it was a loan rather than a gift, as it survives as an heirloom of Train's descendants to this day, and actually we have it on display at the moment, courtesy of those descendants. Interestingly, an engraving of the piece appears in the lavish Abbotsford edition of the Waverley novels, published in the 1840s. But what a curious thing to have an object held by a real individual who found himself first fictionalised, then illustrated, and eventually memorialised for his literary doppelganger, as his grave here shows. His grave is in Dumfries and Galloway. The Mell itself is now known for its association with the novel rather than with the original historical owner. It seems that in some cases at least, life imitates art. Sometimes an item did not suit Scot's aesthetic taste or moral sensibilities. Here he is writing to James Skene of Rubislaw in 1822. A man has brought a chair which he calls John Knox's. It is an ugly one and does not suit me, but if its pedigree can be ascertained, perhaps the Antiquaries may choose to have it. They'll mop it up. Along with other material, such as this, you can see a sort of close-up of it up here, a pierced calf's heart, which was unearthed in Dalkeith, a ritual piece that subsequently made its way into the National Collection here in Edinburgh. Sometimes there were better or more appropriate final resting places for material, and Scot readily helped to channel it on. I've tried to illustrate through just a fraction of the available examples that the Abbotsford collection is witty, intelligent, and expansive in its horizons, and that it deliberately engages with contemporary issues. It encourages the imagination of a dialogue between objects and cultures separated by time and space. Dr. Stephen Bann discusses his curatorial communication between objects from different times in his seminal work of 1984, The Clothing of Cleo. The only problem with this and other academic studies of its kind is that they do not factor in the complexities of later family curation as the generations pass by, often discussing the intended conversations between objects on display as they're read in later iterations rather than in their original assemblages. The best known example of this at work is the octagonal display case in the Abbotsford Library, the miniature cabinet of curiosities containing locks of hair, tumblers, knives, snuff boxes, and even an oat cake crumb from the battlefield of Culloden. Can't vouch for the recipe of oat cakes in the 18th century if you've seen this crumb. This display table still exists today, and it is vitally important as part of Abbotsford's history as a tourist site. We were, in fact, the very first author's house in Britain to open to the public. However, it is a fact that the items inside, although almost all collected by Scot, were not displayed in this way during his lifetime. The demand of visitors to see these smaller gabions or portable relics created a necessity to showcase them in a more accessible and visually appealing way, and the family duly acquiesced. New relationships between objects were sought out, and new curatorial intent was seized upon, usually attributed to Sir Walter Scott himself. Perhaps in the end what matters is that people find meaning and relevance of their own, and not how authentically they can trace that meaning back to Scott himself. It all depends on which way you slice the cake, or the oat cake. All of this makes for one of the most fascinating curatorial jobs you could possibly hope to have. So what of the future of Abbotsford? What do we hope to do with the material we have and the fascinating stories we have to tell? The Abbotsford Trust is 11 years old this year, and 5 years on from our royal reopening in 2013, we're now looking ahead to the next decade of activity, and we're recasting our charitable mission and vision to reaffirm our commitment to access, engagement, and diversity. Our future ambition is not just to foster research, but to be at the forefront of it. We hope to become an accredited museum and to raise awareness of and interest in the Abbotsford collection as an extraordinary national museum in miniature, completely representative of its zeitgeist. We want to curate thought-provoking exhibitions, bringing material to the Scottish borders from across oceans and international borders. Scott's garden rooms and outdoor structures, such as his beautiful glass pavilion, still await major conservation and restoration effort. And all of this cannot happen without significant fundraising activity. Like many small independent heritage organisations, our resources are small, but our dreams are big. Standing here in 2018, we have a world of opportunities at our feet. We are in the middle of a series of literary bicentenaries, and indeed the bicentenary of the creation of Abbotsford itself. We have had and continue to have phenomenal support in the cultural and heritage sector, both through generous sharing of time and expertise and through the financial bread and butter, those grants that make projects possible and resources tenable. Due to a legal complexity dating back to the 1830s, the Abbotsford collection is overseen by two charitable trusts, the Abbotsford Trust and the Faculty of Advocates Abbotsford Collection Trust. And we continue to benefit from the existence and experience of our Joint Collection Advisory Committee, drawing on the experience of nationally celebrated academics, curators, and historians. For a small, independent charitable trust, we are increasingly well connected and supported, and I feel tremendously lucky professionally to have had such a supportive network of bodies and individuals in my orbit, not least National Museum Scotland and the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The biggest hurdle Abbotsford faces is intimately linked with our unique selling point. Doo-doo. The house, garden, and designed landscape is so representative of the passions, enthusiasms, and spirit of its creator that Sir Walter Scott is paradoxically both our raison d'etre and sometimes a hurdle to overcome. Those that do visit with no idea of the impacts and achievements of one of Scotland's greatest sons are almost always transformed by their learning, feeling they have accessed a great mind in a meaningful and accessible way. They sign their name in our visitor book, often accompanied by curiously emotional charged comments about connections and about empathy. Others arrive with preconceptions long established, part of Scott's mythic afterlife where he's been parboiled, stripped of his intricacies and presented as a one-dimensional and pompous traditionalist, out of touch with his own times and fatally irrelevant to today. Many more still have never heard of him at all. Scott? Irrelevant? Nothing could be further from the truth. Scott wasn't just one of the most influential storytellers of the last 2 centuries. He was also a historian, a reviewer, and a commentator on the political and societal upheavals of his time. He offers a voice from the age of empire and industrial revolution, and a commentary on the aftermath of Union in 1707. His role in reforging the symbols of Scottish identity that have become recognised around the world, and in marketing the landscapes and people of Scotland, effectively gave birth to our national tourist industry, a vital cornerstone of the economy to this day. When King George IV visited Scotland in 1822, the first time a monarch had done so in well over 150 years, it was Sir Walter Scott that superintended the festivities, acting as a mouthpiece of the Scottish people and the cultural custodian of the nation. Yet the version of Scotland that Scott gave us is not an uncontroversial one. Exploring the complexities that lie behind nationhood and its connections to place and history, Scott's work reminds us that nation has a kaleidoscope of meanings and that there's no simple recipe for how we locate ourselves in relation to it. The year 2021 will mark 250 years since Walter Scott was born in the old town of Edinburgh. I'm very excited about this, everybody. Please enjoy. Yay! One of our major ambitions in the next phase in Abbotsford's journey is to encourage the people and cultural organisations of Scotland to re-evaluate the author of Waverley's impact, relevance and enduring legacy in this anniversary year. We're about to spearhead a fundraising campaign for the support of a national partnership, which, if successful, would appoint a project coordinator to link up, nurture and champion the ambitions of arts and heritage organisations across Scotland to tell their own surprising stories about Scott in 2021, from his sympathetic treatment of outsiders and minorities to his personal journey with mental health problems. From all of the places and the landscapes in his novels to the places he visited or touched during his lifetime, there are very few sites and institutions in Scotland that cannot boast some connection with Scott or claim ownership of his astonishing legacy. There is more than enough to go around. Alongside this, we hope to offer a programme of inspiring and ambitious activity at Abbotsford itself, in what we hope will represent a step change in our visibility and reach for national and international audiences. This year of celebration and conversation would allow us to shine a light on the many facets of Scott, many of them surprising, subversive, or contemporarily significant. Our hope is that this will allow people to see Scott for what he really is, one of the most brilliant minds of our past, trying to make sense of the age-old conflicts between heart and head, extremism and moderation, tradition and progress, and the complex relationship we have and still have with nationhood. Scott is far more relevant to the Scotland and the world of today than we realise or acknowledge, and Abbotsford's long-term future and sustainability is bound inextricably to our ability to restore his reputation and his relevance. It's going to be quite a rollercoaster ride, and fellows, I do hope to see you there. Thank you. you.